started late. They might just extend the year. I just feel like I don't know.
Get my former.
feel like for a long time.
It'll be interesting to see the questions.
I'm excited. It's going to be.
It'll be fun. It's live streamed. Also, guys, so we're live streaming it. Yesterday, my dad in Santa Barbara called me. And
oh, wow.
Nice.
Okay, cool.
Because a bunch of friends of mine called me to see you on TV. I was like, I wasn't on TV.
Close enough.
He was like, you didn't tell him. I said, they were live streaming it.
But I think he can probably still watch it, right? Isn't it recorded?
I told him that, but he was like, people calling me, and I was like, relax.
Are one of your parents here?
Coverage.
Whoa.
Yeah, so August, I feel like we can't really be there. Yes. Oh.
Thank you.
So the summer's just a little complicated.
It was such a busy
And you know what I
complicated.
want is a vacation.
before October 7th.
Like, I don't know that I want to go to Israel with the family where I'm doing the thing where it's like I'm working and then they keep running around. It's like, I just want to go like
You could
on vacation.
take part of it as a vacation, but it's hard
I
to
feel
be
like
a
Israel
vacation
is
in
not.
it. Stuff about going far away, but he doesn't really know what he wants.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Love me well.
Am I good?
Go to Montclair.
Good morning. We're gonna
with us today to discuss and respond to all of those questions. So let me introduce you. Ben Samuels has been at Haaretz for 10 years and is currently the outlet's U.S. correspondent based in Washington, D.C. Felissa Kramer is the editor-in-chief at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, JTA, and Jodi Rudoren is editor-in-chief of The Forward. Formerly, she was a reporter and editor at the New York Times and served as the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem from 2012 to 2015. Welcome to all of you. I want to dive right in, but I first want to say how honored we are to have these really distinguished journalists with us to answer the questions that all of you have been thinking about over the last months as you've been consuming the coverage. So let's dive in. I want to start out at a fairly high level and ask all three of our panelists, can you share your perspectives on the media coverage related to October 7th and the ensuing war? How well are mainstream outlets doing at covering the events? Jodi, do you want to start?
Sure. Good morning. Thanks for having us, and thanks everybody for coming early to be here. Some of us, I came from New Jersey. I left yesterday, and it's exciting to be here. We're going to talk for a while, probably all about that question. I would say, and it's been incredible the prominence that this storyline has retained for such a long time, not in the mainstream media, on social media, in specialty niche media, really everywhere. And it's been in a very challenging set of circumstances. Two massive challenges are the advent of social media and AI that has promulgated misinformation, disinformation, manipulated images and storylines, and also manipulated amplification of certain messages. And a second massive challenge is that there has been no independent international journalists allowed into Gaza for the entire war on their own, only in embeds with the IDF. And that's a stark difference to all of the other Gaza wars, including the two that I covered when I was there in 2012 and 2014. Given those truly massive challenges and the basic challenge of 24/7 intense news coverage, I would overall give the media a strong grade. I think that we have seen incredible video investigations corroborating or challenging narratives around what's happening with the military, including with the hospital explosion. We've seen really powerful video documentary and work narratives, like there was a reconstruction of everything that happened at Be'eri in the New York Times. Actually, I don't think that was a video, that was an article, but there was a different kibbutz that had a video. And we've seen other investigative work, like for example, the sexual violence investigation by the Times that was has been massively challenged as well by the left. So, and I guess the other thing that really strikes me, this is now a long time ago, 5 months ago, but in the first, 2 or 3 weeks especially, I was really struck by what I saw on television news, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, where you just saw Israelis talking about what happened, hostage families, kibbutz victims. Those networks, of course, chose the English speakers, but I was struck by imagining the American audience viewing this and experiencing what a lot of us experience when we go there, right? Which is how parallel and also very different Israeli Jewish lives are from American lives. And so I thought that it was a platforming of the Israeli experience that I don't think I had seen in quite as extensive a way. And so that felt very human to me. And I thought there was, it's been a very hard circumstance to report in this war. And not really in the business of giving out grades to my colleagues, but, B+, I don't know.
Thank you, Jodi.
I won't even speculate a B+ or any, no grades at all. I used to be an education reporter grading. There's a complicated debate about that too. So, but I share your take, Jodi, that like the volume of journalism produced about this conflict in this moment is just unbelievable. And I think that's part of, that's both like a great thing, right? There's so much information available, and also a real challenge. And it's, you know, it really is impossible to consume it all. Our jobs is to like know what our competitors are doing, and like we can't consume it all. I know from hearing from our readers at JTA, who include both, you know, people coming directly, but JTA is also a service providing news coverage to local and global Jewish news organizations as well. We hear from readers in both places that, you know, concern that the media is biased against Israel. We hear concern that the media is giving too little attention to the concerns of Palestinians. We hear it all, and if you look around the world, that, you know, every possible critique can be made, and also every possible critique could be true depending on what slice of the media you're consuming. And I think the challenge of consumption is really significant. We're talking about sorting through disinformation and AI-generated images. They're, you know, nobody needs a journalist to encounter that. That's in front of news consumers all the time. And so I think, you know, the challenge for journalism and the challenge for people who care about consuming news and want to be well informed is really the volume. But that's also a good thing, and we're blessed to be able to contribute to that.
Yeah, well, first off, pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you for coming. I totally agree with everything both Jodi and Phyllis have said. One thing that I would add is that a unique challenge has been how personal this conflict has been for a lot of my colleagues and for myself. You know, there are very few Jewish or Israeli journalists that aren't deeply personally affected by what has happened on October 7th and the ensuing months. So that is definitely one issue that has been sort of at the forefront, especially with all of my colleagues in Israel. You know, this is a very lived-in 24-hour real thing. It is not something that is being consumed through your phone or TV or your computer. You know, this is a lived-in real life experience. So that's very difficult. It's, you know, it's funny to say that it's kind of become normal, but 5 months in, you know, people have adjusted, and this is sort of, there is no normalcy to what's going on, but at the same time, there has been sort of a routine that has been developed. There is sort of knowing what to expect. There is a sort of pattern that emerges through the news cycle, you know, the ups and downs, the twists and turns. 5 months in, you have a general preparedness of how to approach this versus what happened in the ensuing days and weeks after October 7th, where nothing was precedented and everything was new, and you really had to go into 24-hour triage mode. And that's not really the case anymore, but that presents a whole new set of complications where you try to avoid complacency and you try to, you know, continue to hold yourself accountable on a 24-hour basis. So
I just want to add one thing, which is I think another, not exactly new, but I think a thing that has had a much more profound impact on this storyline than certainly any prior words, but really any other storyline I know, is podcasts. And I think that the range of really good podcasts that have really devoted a lot of time to this storyline is incredible. And I just feel like a lot of people are getting deep, dimensionalized coverage of many kinds. Some are like pure narrative, the narrative experience of people in the war on both sides. Some are really analytical, and you know, there's like a panoply. There's always been a panoply of experts, of, you know, Israeli experts, and I just feel like one of the challenges of the podcast space is how many podcasts there are, but it seems like over the last 5 months, there's been, you know, quite a number that have done a pretty decent and really thorough and really committed job to this story. And I feel like more and more, it's funny because I listen to some, and then I'll hear from friends in the synagogue or my kid's school or whatever about, did you hear this? And it's something I don't even know exists. And there's a show that they've become really reliant on. And I think it relates to what Ben said about the personal nature of how people are experiencing the story, and audio is such a emotional and personal and intimate medium, that I think that's one of the reasons why. And, you know, as Felissa said, the overwhelming amount of information, but also diverse array of sources. I think people have compiled for themselves, or should and need to, a diet, a mix of like, I'm going to go to this live blog to get my what actually happened overnight. I'm going to go to this place to get my deep dive narrative experience. I want to be here for my expert analysis. Here's where I look for opinion, and you know, here's where I look for the Jewish perspective. And I think having that kind of rounded diet is a way to avoid overload also, although it can be overloaded itself.
Right. Sometimes I go on a news fast, even for a day, just to break out for a minute. It's an interesting point.
Must be nice.
Yes, exactly. I'm not in the business anymore. So I'm wondering, I'm listening to, for instance, Unholy, which I think is a fantastic analytical podcast, but I'm wondering if each one of you can talk. It's an interesting point that Jodi brought up. I'd like all of you to leave a little bit more with more to consume, like you don't have enough already. What are you either listening to as a podcast, reading particularly, that you would like to note for this audience?
Well,
when you have time.
I don't listen to podcasts. I have no commute. There's always, when I'm not working, there's always somebody talking to me in my house, so I cannot figure out. Okay, well,
sorry, he told me to do that.
Sorry. Can people hear?
We'll work on it. We're going to fix it.
Okay.
You can project more. I was confessing that I don't listen to podcasts at all, so I can't help you there. You know, I try to read, I try to tune into the really excellent, there's been a slew of them in the last week even, kind of synthesis pieces in non-Jewish media that are often citing JTA stories or forward stories or Haaretz stories to make to paint a broader picture of the state of the Jews today. And I find tuning into those always prompts new questions that we can ask as journalists. I would also just say, and this is like totally off topic, but I'm really trying to force myself to read things that aren't news, because I think that it can be way too much, and there's a lot about who we are as people that doesn't have to be rooted in what happened today. And so I read things that are relevant, I think, usually, but I just read a set of short stories that's coming out by Maya Arad, and a prominent Israeli writer whose first book in English is coming out. And that helps me make sense of everything I see in the news too, right? I'm gaining a new understanding of Israeli culture and the Israeli outlook that I didn't have before. So read All of Us every day, and also other things would be my advice.
Okay, Ben?
Forgive the shameless self-promotion, but Haaretz does have a weekly podcast hosted by my colleague Allison Kaplan-Summer. It is a really great way to just sort of have your finger on the pulse of what's going on, not on a sort of an hour-by-hour level. You can read our live blog if you want that. You know, the Forward also has very up-to-date reporting, as does JTA. But if you just sort of want to dive in and see, okay, what is the story of the week? Our podcast is terrific. I also just want to take a moment to recognize the added value that institutions like Haaretz and JTA and the Forward have, because, you know, this has become the biggest story in the world overnight after October 7th. But, you know, there are people on the ground with Haaretz that have incomparable value that they bring to the table in terms of their understanding of the context and their familiarity with the players on the ground and their sourcing, and just everything that they bring is just something that isn't really met by mainstream media when, you know, obviously everyone is doing the best they can, but sometimes there's a tendency to parachute into the hot topic of the day and they cover it ad nauseum for a few weeks, and then it just sort of fades from the national consensus. Obviously this conflict is kind of breaking the mold where it's just held for so long, but, you know, Ron Campius from JTA kind of has written the book on how to cover the politics of Israel within the American Jewish community. And Jacob Kornbluth from the Forward, you know, he has like 7 duplicates of himself because he can be at so many different places at once. So, you know, there is an added value that organizations like ours bring to the table. So I would encourage you all to read us.
I'll be quick if you want me to.
I want to hear what you have,
Okay.
your podcast. I want to know what Jodi Rudoren is listening to, but also then I want to follow up on this question that Ben has raised, which is, what is the place of the Jewish news or outlets?
I can do that transition.
Yeah, I want you to do that.
I'm so excited.
And also a little insight also into what's happening in your organizations with all these people. Incredible. It's an intense, intense period.
Thank you. So I will say, one of the things, just thinking about particular products and how I use them, I think the Haaretz has a thing, Today in the War Today or something. It's a newsletter, and it literally distills in one paragraph kind of the things you need to know, and it's ahead of us in time. So I find that to be a nice grounding, like just find out what happened yesterday or today, or in terms of also if I've been away and I want to just catch up, I actually really rely on the Times of Israel or the New York Times' live briefing. I think is the best way to sort of read in. From a podcast perspective, I wrote a couple of weeks ago about this incredible series that Israel Story has started right after the war called Wartime Diaries. Mishi Harman, the host and director of Israel Story and of the series, says they're not stories, they're little snapshots of conversation, slivers of conversation, but I think they really are stories. There's lots of ways to define story. They're just individual Israelis, Druze, Palestinians, other people, mostly Israeli Jews, talking about slices of the experience. And they're short. I listen to them on 1.25. Walking, if you live in New York or if you walk anywhere, they're just a quick fix of, oh, I feel connected to this on a human level, which I just think is so important as you try to think about the big picture and the policy and da-da-da-da. I'm doing an event later today about the international law issues, and I feel like sometimes you just need to hear a human voice and hear a story. So I love Wartime Diaries. I also, I'm very emotionally connected to the daily podcast at the New York Times from my history, but I just think they've done a remarkable job on this story, and I would particularly commend you to the episode called 1948, and if you listen to the end, you'll see why. I got special thanked. It's very exciting. And just now I'll transition to the product that we create that I think is most helpful in this way is our morning briefing. It's called Forwarding the News, and it really is positioned to sort of help you find clarity amid the chaos, not just of this war, but really of the whole American Jewish story. And it includes some sort of surprise and delight, a video or a photo or a feature story that might be a little bit of a break. And you can sign up at forward.com/newsletters or something like that. And I think, that's the transition I want to make to the question of what's the role. As I said earlier, I spent my life working in secular mainstream media. I covered 2 wars in Gaza for the New York Times. And now I'm here, and I've been at the Forward for 4 years. People have been asking me this question of what's the role of Jewish journalism for all that time, and I think I was faking it before, honestly. I think I was like, oh, this, and it was like my academic answer. But I feel it now because you feel it now, and you've been telling us about what our role is, which is to provide real, independent, truth-based, reporting-based journalism and real, broad, challenging opinion journalism within a Jewish lens, within a Jewish frame, in a place that feels both safe but also rigorous and honest, and as Mark Rowan was saying yesterday, true. And so I think what we've been hearing from you as we've had a growth in readership, but also just a growth in readership and donations, but really what's most meaningful to me is a growth in a sort of outpouring to us of people saying, thank you for what you're doing. This is a hard time, as Ben talked about, and I need to have real journalism in a Jewish way and with a Jewish lens, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I would agree with you exactly that. I think we've seen in our readership, I think what so many Jews feel, which is a need for refuge, and people coming to us because we are a Jewish space, they can get news and they know that the starting point includes them, right? That their safety is a core thing that we are paying attention to in our coverage. And I think that we all know, I think as people and as professionals, and that's important right now. And I would add that, like, you know, I feel in our mandate comes in our name, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Like, we aren't war reporters. We have Ron Campius in Washington, who did write the book on covering U.S.-Israel relations from the United States. But we also, like, have a real mandate to cover the Jewish experience, and this is a moment it happened in Israel, and decisions being made there are resonating outward, but it's also a Jewish story being experienced by Jews all over the world, even Jews who never set foot in Israel or wish it didn't exist, right? Which we have learned a lot about in the last 5 months. It's a Jewish story for all of us, and we're really committed to that story, to storytelling about the Jewish experience. So that leads us to do things that, it's a competitive field in covering what's happening today in hostage negotiations. We're committed to this space of, well, what are Jews going to do on Purim when we read a story that, about a villain who tries to destroy us, and there's also a chapter where we exact revenge. What does that tell us about ourselves right now? How can we think about that? We published a story already because we do serve print clients who lay out their papers in advance. We've published a story already about efforts to add to the Haggadah for this moment. This is going to be the first big Jewish holiday where everybody is gathered since October 7th. How is everyone going to make sense of that, right? And those stories, like, the forward will tell, Haaretz will tell, but there's not that many places that are going to tell it. And I hope, when we look back, that there's a real body of that, because this will decide the next chapter of who we are as a people.
I just want to, before we go to Ben, I just want to say, yes, it has occurred to me as we approach also Passover, the idea that I've often said, in every generation, someone rises against us, and never really believed that it would happen in my generation. I never thought my son would actually see it. So, right, and a changed world that you have to deal with, these outlets have to deal with on so many different levels. I want to go to Ben so he can answer that question, but then I'd also like Ben to talk about, at first the focus was, in those first couple months, on the massacres of October 7th. And then we had everything that started to occur here as far as on college campuses and the rise of protests and demonstrations, anti-Semitism on the rise, a real spike this year. And Ben, I imagine then it was a bit, I kind of feel like we were watching Israel, and then also Israel was watching us. And I wonder how Haaretz is doing, and also how you experienced that switch as you started to report more heavily on the fallout here.
I think there's something I'm not speaking as an expert on other conflicts, but speaking as someone who has covered this conflict extensively, dehumanization is kind of baked into the DNA of how the sides relate to each other, how coverage tends to seep into it, not just from both sides, just to be extremely clear. And I think that has been something that Haaretz has tried extremely hard to stay true to its mission, which is bringing Israeli news to an international audience. We are unfiltered. We're 50% Hebrew original reporting that's translated in English, 50% original English content. And there is a problem that emerges sometimes where bad faith actors will take mistranslated things out of context, where they will take snippets, they will use it as validation for their own dehumanization of the other side. So that is definitely something that has been a pretty unfortunately frequent pattern that has emerged in the past few months. I would also just say that Haaretz has been extremely critical of this Israeli government and how they've approached the war. And they've been critical of this Israeli government leading up to the war. October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. It emerged 9 months after this Israeli government attempted to completely overwrite the country's judiciary system, and there were unprecedented protests that were going in the streets, and we covered this on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, like relentless amount of dedication to this. And then October 7th happened, and then we had to dedicate our efforts tenfold to that. So with that context, we had an editorial that came out the day after the attack that said that, Netanyahu bore some responsibility on his shoulders for these attacks. And there's been a lot of criticism within the Jewish community of ours consistently that, we take too left of its own, but, we definitely have our editorial point of view, and we are relentless in pursuing that. And like Jodi said, truth is our number one North Star that we are always oriented toward in our reporting. So I think our readers respect that, and I think despite any attempts to kind of take things out of context, whether it's Hebrew mistranslations or headlines or whatever it may be, I think, we've done a good job with that.
And I'll just jump in here and say, I think that you're pointing to a real challenge for consumers of journalism about this conflict. There are many people who are newly tuned in to Haaretz or other Israeli publications. And I would add to that, I think also the European Jewish press is not super robust, certainly not in English, but it exists and there's a lot of stuff happening there. And I think we hear about that too. And it can be disorienting that there is a slightly different ethic of journalism in Israel versus in the United States. And so when we hear Ben say Haaretz is a left-wing paper and our editorial agenda reflects that, that's
agenda.
Our editorial, when I say agenda, I mean set of things we're going to do, is that's not something that Jodi or I would ever say. It wouldn't fit in the American paradigm. It makes total sense in Israel, and there's a range of journalism that you can consume, all of it high quality, from outlets with, much of it high quality from outlets with different perspectives. And so I think for people who are newly consuming from both places, that can be jarring and also and be hard to make sense of. And I don't have a solution to that except that I recognize that's a challenge. And so when I hear from readers saying, well, the Jerusalem Post said this, why aren't you saying it that way? Or Haaretz said this, why aren't you saying it that way? There's an opportunity for education and that's good.
I would also just say even more basically that the fact that there is a robust English language press for outlets, basically, who produce significant reports from Israel in English is wildly new compared to the prior. When I moved to Israel in 2012 to be the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times, we relied on a daily email that was very expensive that translated the highlights of the Hebrew press. None of you got that thing, right? Now that even during my 4 years there, the Times of Israel started, different things happened. But now, not only are all of you reading directly in English, the Israeli press, but so are all the international journalists, all of the non-Jews, everybody's reading this. And that's totally different from how it was in Israel during, say, the Second Intifada. That didn't exist. But also, is there another, besides Brexit, is there another international storyline where there's a robust English press telling you what's happening from the local press? Certainly not China, Russia, maybe India, I don't know, not really. So this is a totally distinct, unique situation, which makes the questions for how does the mainstream secular press deal with this storyline different, and our own job different. Because we know you're all looking at Israeli news directly, and you should get something different from us than that.
That's a very interesting point. I wanted to ask also, do you have a sense, the editors, Ben, how much of your readership is moving out of the Jewish community and sort of into general people who are interested in the conflict? Are they reading the Jewish press? Because the other thing to say is, right, that sort of regionally, I have watched over my career I was a longtime journalist, news operations contract. Those that have not contracted in Israel are really Jewish outlets, and the ones and many of them that are now publishing in English. So there's a type of regional expertise that you used to have at a lot of bureaus, but that you don't have in the mainstream media so much anymore. And I'm wondering how many people have moved over to watch this conflict closely to Jewish organizations, news organizations. Do we have any idea?
I mean, I would distinguish, first of all, between Jewish news organizations and Israeli news organizations.
Yeah.
We know that the English language Israeli news organizations saw massive increases in their audience in the fall. The Times of Israel literally had the fastest growing website in the world in October.
Wow.
I am presuming that many of those readers were not Jewish. I mean, by both math and instinct. In terms of our own audience, we have always had a smattering of we don't have any, I don't know factually the demographics, certainly by religion, of our overall audience. The only way we know the only way any news outlet knows the demographics of their audience is through Google Analytics estimations, and they guess people's gender and age based on their search habits and things like that, their computer habits, and they don't tell us about people's religion. We know from our email, like, people show up and they say, like, I'm not Jewish, but I read you for this and that reason. And my sense is that, and this is just my sense, my impression. I do read all my email. I respond to all of it. I'm sure I've written to many of you. But my sense is that the proportionality has stayed about the same. So we've grown, and we've always had a smattering of non-Jews, and now we have a slightly larger smattering of non-Jews. And if any of you are here, thank you.
And exactly as Jodi's saying, we only know what we know about our readers, but what I'm looking for, and I've been pleased to see, is JTA cited in non-Jewish press, because we do have that expertise, right? And so when our reporting is cited, that tells me that both the news organization or journalist who's citing us is looking to experts. That's gives me confidence about that person's body of work. And also, I want people to see our reporting wherever they encounter it. It would be awesome if they came to you came to our site, signed up for our newsletters, came to our events, but also if our journalism is getting encountered on social media through shares or through links in mainstream media, we are thrilled. We know that our work is having an impact, and we have seen that.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, as a reporter, there's a bit of a firewall in terms of actually looking at the statistics. I think, you try to sort of create your own sort of guardrails on not allowing your audience dictate your reporting too much. So I think that's something that I've tried to stick to pretty rigidly. That being said, Haaretz is a subscriber-based model, and our subscription base has grown exponentially since the war. And we've accordingly met that with added value. So we have subscriber-only Zoom sessions with writers and experts, and we have these newsletters that Jodi mentioned, and explainers, and all of these different things that you wouldn't get unless you were a Haaretz subscriber. So good journalism costs money, and I would really encourage everyone to subscribe to Haaretz. And and I think kind of like everyone was saying, that there are real life ways to track this that aren't just based off numbers. And obviously you don't want to rely on anecdote to base your value of success, but there is a real life feeling that our work is landing on a bigger basis than it would have before this conflict broke out.
All of that is so fascinating, and I think that's a part of the reporting that we haven't thought about explicitly, right? I want to go back a little bit to some issues that I have experienced. I reported from the region for 13 years for Reuters and then CBS. And there's a few things that I think occur across a great many mainstream American outlets that I find troubling and less informative than I would like it to be. And I'm going to name them, and I think some of them, and then I'd like you to react to these issues. No one's going to be surprised by this, right? The issue of not saying high up in a story, Hamas a terrorist organization, a militant jihadist organization, or that it has been labeled as such by the US or the EU, US and the EU. That's one. Because it's important, right, when you name an organization, usually in journalism, to characterize it. The second one, the unwillingness to attach numbers to Hamas combatants. When outlets say 30,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and they say, for instance, a third of them or half of them women and children, but they don't bother, which is a really key figure, to name either IDF or Hamas figures of combatants. A very important part of the story for both readers at The Hague. Another thing, it is not clear to me that readers understand generally that Gaza is no longer occupied, that there's a border with Egypt. So there's things that I think that wouldn't require a huge amount of space and would be helpful for readers who are trying to characterize and understand especially Israel's prosecution of this war. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the lack of detail about those things.
Okay. So no, you guys are like looking at me. So fine. I mean, each of those we could talk about them for a long time, and each of them I've been involved in lengthy discussions about each of them, both at my former newsroom and at my current newsroom. So I don't want to take too much time. I'll start with the combatants, which is, I think, in some ways the trickiest one, because the truth is the IDF does not know how many of the people who have been killed were combatants. It's very difficult to know how many people, what even the definition of a combatant is in Hamas. I've been there. I've been to funerals of teenagers who were killed, who were counted by the Gaza Health Ministry as children, but were clearly Hamas fighters. I've also covered funerals of people who were killed who got labeled Hamas by Hamas after their death as martyrs, but were not fighters. And you only can figure all of that out by doing extensive reporting on individual cases, not by some list. One of the reasons we do not say women report the number of children is because that is a number based on people who are aged 18 and under, and many of them are combatants. And I've actually just wrote to a lefty friend of mine who wrote a newsletter where she was making a big point about women and children. I'm like, just so you know, and she was contrasting it with combatants. So it's complicated, and terminology is not always as simple as it seems. In terms of Hamas being a terror organization, I actually think one of the profound differences especially in the early months of this conflict was how regularly people were identifying it as a Hamas terror attack in all kinds of terror attack and Hamas terror organization in all kinds of outlets. It is clearly, has been declared a terror organization. It is also a political organization. And so, it's not quite as black and white as it seems. I know I wrote, one of the things I think is really a big waste of time is when people get very upset about the use of the word militants. You yourself talked about it. It's a terror organization. It's a militant jihadist organization. Calling Hamas militants does not mean they're not terrorists and does not mean that you don't think they're bad. It's just another word that actually also, but it's not a military organization. It's not a government and it's not a military, so it's not the same. So language does matter, and it requires some amount of nuance. I totally agree with you about people do not talk often enough about Egypt's role in keeping Rafah closed in the blockade during peacetime, and also, of course, now when there has been very, very restrictive rules on who can leave through Rafah. The one you didn't mention is people refer to the West Bank without mentioning that it's occupied. We don't do that. We refer to it as the occupied West Bank, which is what the US and the UN and Israel itself, until 5 minutes ago, referred to it as in its military documents. So we can go on. I have I think I've written twice about this, about something called conflict code, where words that you think have certain meanings in the regular English language have a different meaning to combatants in this conflict. There is a whole other war that goes on over what language which journalists use. And I want to say, I think it's massively important. I agree with you. It matters. And the amount of energy that is spent on this war is over the words that are used by journalists in this conflict is insane, and is not matched by any other story in the world.
Are you calling me insane?
No, not you. and you know what? I shouldn't use that word.
No.
I mean, I know it's not a good word to use, but it is outsized in a way that we should be curious about. Before October 7th, my longstanding theory about the amount of money spent on the pro-Israel side and person hours spent on the pro-Palestinian side undermining journalism and journalists and attacking them personally, largely over these kinds of language issues. My theory was that it was about people's feeling of impotence around the actual conflict, that because things had been so stagnant for so long, it felt so hopeless to work in a coexistence group or whatever it is you might want to do to advance your agenda. So instead you were like, let's destroy the journalism. And I'm not quite sure what my new theory is on exactly why it's happening now, because now there is very clearly so much to do on the ground.
Exponential growth.
It has had an exponential growth. I mean, I get it. I think people feel helpless, and they're like, well, if I could just get these people to call Hamas a terror organization, then
people would believe it.
And I think, in some ways there's a much larger issue at stake here too, which is people are trying to, I think are getting distracted or are trying to distract themselves with some details around this thing. Like, for example, last week with the aid convoy, people are very worried about the thing we actually don't know yet, which is how many people might have been killed by gunfire and how many people were killed in some kind of a stampede or run over by a truck, or what caused what happened first. The big picture, so many people are starving there that there was that event.
Yes.
And I think similarly, people always ask me, can you believe the Hamas figures on the number of casualties? And it's like, I have a whole long answer to that, and I can tell you about how that's reported and how the international agencies come later and confirm or deny the reports. But the reality is if it's 30,000 or 29,000 or 32,000, is that massively change your understanding of what's happening? I don't think so. But I think people want to feel better about who they think is their team. So they're like, if those guys are lying, if the terrorists are lying about the numbers, then I feel better. And I think, honestly, I think people should stop trying to feel better. Yeah. It's awful. The situation is awful. October 7th was awful. What's happening in Gaza is awful. And, if you feel connected to it, as I know most of you or all of you probably do, definitely read the short story collection to have some relief. But, also, it's awful. Sit in the awful.
Just to add to that, I think it's really important to stress, 100% agree with everything Jodi said, just to really double down. It doesn't disqualify an article that is fact-checked, edited, well-reported, if it doesn't have every prerequisite qualification that you demand to see in terms of both sidesing the issue. So if it has 95% of these qualifications and these terminologies and whatever, but it doesn't have this one thing, that doesn't mean that the general point doesn't hold. And I think as people need to kind of release themselves from these shackles of these internal checklists.
Sorry, so one more thing. The opposite is also true, Ben. It's just so important. I just did a presentation for high school kids about disinformation. And one of the things I pointed out, I used this as a case study. Many of you may have seen this insane story of the IDF is harvesting organs of dead people in Gaza. And what I did was a close reading of the source, which was this group called Monitor. And the language that they use is filled with red flags about why you should not trust the source. It's got all of this language that's using using terms that, I mean, besides genocide and, and it also has like the so-called whatever, and there are all these red flags. So yes, I agree with you that if like one time they didn't say terror in the 3rd paragraph but said it in the 17th paragraph, you shouldn't disqualify. You should certainly be on guard for loaded language that will betray the source's biases. Absolutely, that's media literacy 101, you need to do that.
Yeah.
Great. I just want to say, so, and I agree with everything that you are saying, and would add this, that for many of the people, and certainly this panel, have this sort of deep, granular knowledge of the conflict, the history of the conflict. But many readers, especially young ones, and outside of the Jewish community, outside of the Palestinian, the Israeli communities, may not have a very good understanding. So that is, again, why I would say that that idea about characterizing and offering basic knowledge in articles up front, using words actually that, right, militant includes terrorist, but terrorist is much more specific, right? Militancy is a broad. So what I think I would advocate for, having covered this for many years, is a very clear, the attempt to be clear about who Hamas is, what its charter is, and to do that, even with as few words as possible when you're trying to introduce that group. And my question about it is, what is the impact when you don't do that? And you also mentioned, Jodi, the Palestinian, the Gaza Health Ministry, right? The idea of explaining to people, however briefly, that Hamas has ruled Gaza, and that much of the information coming out from ministries, and also, I want to bring up this last question before we move to questions, that those are controlled in many. I have reported from Gaza, and that is much of the information from local reporters there. If not actually controlled, there is an implicit threat from Hamas about what you're reporting. I have experienced that with fixers in Gaza. It's interesting that news organizations, it's difficult for them to be transparent about what their own reporting challenges are out of Gaza. And I'm wondering if you can talk briefly about that at the moment, as Jodi pointed out, you don't have independent, and I sort of want you to take apart that word, reporters in Gaza, but there are Palestinian local reporters in Gaza that are working for news outlets. What are the challenges that they may face? Why is reporting difficult out of Gaza if there are fixers in place?
I do want to, before I say that, I just want to mention, I think that you're totally right about the broad audience knowing less than the people who sign up to come to this conference. And I appreciate your point about, therefore, part of our role is to ground them in the basics. It is also true that, therefore, our role is to keep it big picture, right? Because they're not necessarily in for the dissertation PhD course. They're looking for, what do I need to know to understand what happened today, to keep it in context of the big picture. In terms of, and one of the examples of that is I've often gotten a lot of email from folks who want to talk about, the Gaza elected Hamas, the people responding to stories that mention people who are in Gaza right now, and they talk about, well, if they hadn't elected Hamas, then this wouldn't be happening. Wow. And it's something like 65% of Gazans have never been eligible to cast a vote because the last election was in 2006. Yeah. And by the way, Hamas didn't get a majority in that election. They got a plurality. They won 43% of the vote. So, and then they violently overthrew their opponent, and that's why they took rule in Gaza. They were not elected as a bona fide government ever by anyone. So we have to be careful about how we characterize that too. Local reporters and local fixers are incredibly important, and can helping you find stories and be acting as translators and arranging transportation and in giving local context and local color. And a place like Gaza, which is incredibly insular, it's kind of amazing to work with local reporters. You just sort of they know everybody, and you kind of get to a town and it kind of opens up to you. But it's the symbiosis between the international independent correspondent who has the context of not living in Gaza, not only hearing what people in Gaza are saying, particularly at a time of war, but is connecting that with both other reporting that they're doing inside Israel, through Washington, working with other, and through their own experience of living in other places and understanding how the Hamas rule of Gaza makes that place challenging for those people. So that's what's missing in the coverage of this conflict. There are those independent eyes, ears, questions are not being posed to the sources in Gaza directly, or even to the fixers in Gaza directly. And because of the language issue, you have at many large outlets almost a bifurcation of the reporting staff, where there's a team working in Arabic to cover the experience of Gazans, working with local reporters and also citizens and looking at Arabic social media, and a separate team working on the Israeli story. And that wasn't true when I ran the coverage of the 2014 war for the New York Times. We were rotating in and out of Gaza. The same correspondents were coming back to Israel and then back to Gaza. We had Arabic-speaking correspondents. My colleague Ben Hubbard was there for a lot of the time, but not only that, and this has been a challenge for Israeli journalists and Israeli outlets for many years, because since 2006, Israeli citizens haven't been allowed to travel into Gaza, even as journalists. So places like Haaretz and Ma'ariv and others didn't have their own correspondents going inside Gaza. They were also dependent on kind of the IDF or the outside sources. So it is, as I like to say, it's all very complicated, but I think, to me, that has been one of the worst things about the coverage of this war. And as much as I love the Daily, you can tell, if you listen to that, you have literally different hosts are doing the Israeli episodes and the Gazan episodes, and you can tell that, sometimes they have them on together, but largely it's they're telling parallel stories, parallel lives, which is, of course, what's been wrong with this whole conflict for 100 years, is that people don't see and understand how much these stories are so interconnected. When we talk about this idea of dueling narratives, that's literally dueling narratives of how people understand and experience the same events, but everything that happens to each member of this conflict affects everybody else's perception and experience. And when you lose that, that's a critical part of the context. I also think, I was just gonna say, just one other thing about the Gaza fixer situation. One of the biggest, most outrageous misunderstanding, and I wish it was only a misunderstanding, I really think it was a manipulation of facts around here, was this wildly insane accusation that the Associated Press and other international organizations had advance warning of the terror attack and were complicit in it, and the evidence given was that photographers who were based in Gaza posted photos of the breach of the border fence within an hour or two of it happening. That is a leap that so misunderstands how this works. Those people who, first of all, Gaza is very small, so once you hear this is happening, you get yourself to the border fence pretty fast. And the fact that photojournalists who live in Gaza and have relationships with international news agencies would rush to the border fence and make photos of that is exactly what you want them to be doing. That's and we rely on that. We journalists, but also we consumers of news, rely on the idea that people are going to rush to news even when it's dangerous for them and for everybody.
Right, to provide coverage.
Yeah,
Okay,
show
so
us.
I just want to do some last thoughts, and we'll have a couple questions. Felissa, Ben, last thoughts, something that you'd like the audience to know?
One thing we haven't really talked about, we've talked a lot about the fog of war and covering actual war. We haven't talked about kind of a big piece of things, which is both what is happening on the ground in the United States and Europe, and the experiences of anti-Semitism that folks are reporting, and also the response to that. Like, that's a huge piece of this story, and subject to a lot of the same fog of war kinds of forces, even though the access issues and the language issues aren't present. And so I think that's worth talking about for a second, that we're making the effort to devote, we've devoted, and you have also, and Haaretz has too, to devote energy to how are Jews responding to what is happening to us and to the discourse around Israel. And that reporting is really hard also. And we get definitely hear from readers, and I have a little more grace for the folks who write to us saying, you said terror in the headline, but in the third paragraph you said militants, which is it? Because I do think that this is everybody is implicated in this moment, and it matters to all of us, and most of us can't do anything and are really scared. So it's annoying, but I understand it, and willing to explain ourselves. But the reporting we're taking on is really challenging, even when it doesn't involve anybody in Israel. And I would just say that it is onerous, and there's so much more we could do. And each of us, our entire newsrooms could be devoted to covering the experience of Israelis right now. The entire newsroom could be devoted to the experience on college campuses, to what's happening in U.S.-Israel relations. There's so many pieces of this with so much happening. It is really onerous. So I would just impress on you, to give us grace in return, and also that there are ways you can help by sharing information about what's happening in your lives. You can donate to us. That will allow us to do more robust reporting more often, and certainly knowing that people who care about getting good news are coming to reliable news organizations that have put in the work and are informed about what we're doing, that is really helpful too.
Thank you, Melissa. I think that was me that wrote to you, but never mind.
Not just you.
I do want to just say, I think that is something we should talk about, that just very briefly, that it's, how do you support Jewish news organizations? You subscribe, you donate, you want more Jewish eyes, writers, brains on this story. You got to support it. It costs money. Ben, last word, and then we'll go to a couple questions.
Yeah, so we've talked about bias frequently throughout the session. I really want to impress that bias can be a two-way street. And the need or desire or tendency to just keep on hammering Hamas, 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 it's a very fine line and slippery slope between that and there are no innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And when you try to just completely contextualize everything that happens in Gaza through the lens of Hamas, there's a tendency to try to justify the humanitarian catastrophe that is going on there. So, it's important to have context, and it's important to couch things in reality and truth, but it's also important not to lean in too far to that to justify something that is unjustifiable.
Thank you so much. Okay, Jeremy, some questions?
Not yet. Okay, there we go. We're not going to have time to get to many questions, unfortunately. We have to wrap up and move to the next sessions here. So I'm sorry, we've received tons of questions and phenomenal questions, and I'm going to do my best to get to the one that received the most votes in the app, and something for everyone to take away. So a lot of people talked about it's very frustrating when misinformation about the war slips casually into conversations in news, talk shows. People talked about New York Times, even AP, and it usually goes unchallenged. Any ideas about how to fight this propaganda from a journalism perspective and how to fight this propaganda from a consumer perspective? Maybe we could do lightning round for that question.
From a consumer perspective, I would add to what Deborah said of supporting us with your dollars by supporting up with, just like you voted up this question. I think when you see quality journalism share it on your Facebook feed or on Instagram or on your listservs that you belong to. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that I think then the related answer of how journalists can fight it is to, not do it and to be better. But I think I do want to echo what Ben said about our understanding of bias and misinformation. It's possible that readers, listeners, audiences who are deeply passionate and deeply involved in the storyline and feel very connected and very impacted by everything that happens in the story are not the best judges of bias in journalism. And that's fine. You're not supposed to be unbiased. You're passionate advocates who've come to devote 2 days of your lives to an organization that's about fighting anti-Semitism, and we need you to do that. But that's not our job. And so I think that consider the fact, you may not even realize how the very same media reports that you feel may be anti-Israel are perceived by other people as being Hasbara for the IDF. You may not read those sources. You may not see them on your social feeds. Or you may think that they sound crazy to you. And I expect they would. But be open to the possibility that, and I would ask you respectfully to judge journalism based on its own stated goals, which is to tell a 360-degree view of a story with humanity and empathy and context and truth, not to advocate a particular point of view.
I would just add to that, this is a time when people want to, right? We want to feel safe, and it can be very appealing to seek out journalism, or, well, I wouldn't necessarily call it journalism, but seek out coverage that exactly aligns with the way you want stories told. And I would say that I understand that appeal, and I also think that makes only consuming things that you already agree with makes a consumer less able to counter that misinformation, coming back to the original question, right? To have confidence that you have a wider view than you might come up with on your own, I think empowers you in those conversations when you encounter people who say things that are really out there because they've gotten their information from an extremely polarized ideological place as well. So just encouraging you to read widely and exactly as Jodi said, accept that journalism on its own territory.
Yeah, would double down on both those points. Consume a diverse media diet, think critically. Yeah.
Yep. Jeremy, do we have time for one more?
Right.
Not.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap there, but I know we received many questions, so if you have time to stay after and chat, please do. But thank you so much for attending. Thank you to our panelists for being here. Thank you to Deborah for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.